Hi, I'm Richard Bliss. I'm joined here by Kenneth Cukier, Senior Editor for Digital at The Economist, and Jenny Grimes, VP of Marketing for NetApp. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
You have often talked about data, you've written about data, it's become such a critical component of what's happening in the world. You refer to it as a new currency. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So data is a new currency or a new resource or the new oil of society. A currency is something that we transact with that has some sort of innate value. And the point about data in the past is that it always had some sort of value if it was a word on a page or was a number in a spreadsheet. The difference today is that its value has increased because we can reuse it in ways that we couldn't before. So where in the past, the primary purpose of the data was the purpose for which it was initially collected. If you collected it, say, for a spreadsheet, for bookkeeping, for your sales transactions, you understood just that. But today, if I have a lot of data, say, of all of my customers going back a decade, I can look at all of that data, not for bookkeeping, but to understand what they like, and therefore I can promote certain things to one group and certain things to another. Or better yet still, I can take their data and I can see, if they're shopping for a given drug at a given moment, I can look back in their purchases and see, was there something about what they were shopping for that could have predicted that they would have had that disease that they would then have a drug for? Now, in the past, that was completely impossible to do. Today, it is possible, and there are companies who are actually doing that, and it's a great thing for society, because if you can take information and apply it to solve human needs, that's a good thing.
So in some ways the data's always been there, right, Jenny?
Well, it's always been there, but what I hear him saying and what our audience responded to is things like data on the balance sheet, and the fact that that reuse is not always, from a process and governance perspective, eased. That there are several inhibitors, right, to the reuse of data.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. First, the whole idea of the reuse of data is relatively novel, and that's simply because 20 years ago, you kind of couldn't do it. You sort of could, but you really couldn't, just because the technology wasn't easy enough to do it, it wasn't cost effective to do it, and also, most importantly, the finding that you could deliver from that wasn't high enough. All three of those features have completely changed today. The cost of storing the data is less, the cost of processing the data is less, but most importantly, the analysis is completely transformed. We can actually extract really interesting insights that we couldn't in the past because of new statistical techniques. It sounds like a big word, but it's machine learning.
Well, and that is an impact to a lot of our customers and partners, because as that analytics capability is refined, we now find data about the data has value, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think that's part of the puzzle that's moved forward too. You're always worrying about insights from the data, but we're now helping get insights about the data as well.
Completely, just to put a point on it. So it's called metadata. And so, if you, for example, there's the company Box, and there's a Dropbox and others who are managing the storage of data, and anyone, NetApp does this as well. If you're managing the storage of data, you would be able to identify what files are called up most appropriately by certain users versus others. First, from a networking point of view, you can better store that data by managing it closer to the person who's going to be using it, which you might not have known at the outset, because you would have thought this portion of HR data would be used by the HR department, but actually it's being used by the marketing and finance department. Right? We learn these things all the time, and so we can find out from the metadata different insights that we never thought we would be able to identify before. That's why we're in a completely new world.
Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about another inhibitor that we hear from our customers and partners about access. Do you see that vector having changed? Is it easier to get access to data now? Or have we restricted that, or over-restricted that in some ways?
It's a little bit of both. I think that to start off with, it's easier today to get information, to get data than before, because the data is more abundant. There are some organizations that are willing to transact with that data and license it. So that's a good thing. So for example, if you wanted to know geolocation for certain users, there's cell phone companies and others and app developers, you can get that data certainly at an anonymized, large, abundant way. However, if you want to use very specific data for specific uses, there are lots of problems with that, and I'll give you one example. So in Britain, one of the problems, as in elsewhere, is fraud, cybercrime to bank accounts. So a given criminal might call a call center and to say, impersonate someone's account, say I'm this person and I therefore want to do this. And if you go back through the phone records of, say, HSBC or another bank, you would see maybe not one or two, but you'd see like hundreds of the same voice.
Pattern.
Right. So what you'd want to do is take that biometric pattern, that voice print, and then sort of identify when a caller calls this bank, say HSBC, that in fact you can say, hey, I think this is the same person. But of course you wouldn't want to stop there because the fraudster doesn't go to just one bank, they go to many. So you'd want to share that voice print with all the other banks in the country. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense because everyone has the same interest in reducing cybercrime. It's a systemic problem, it's not a localized problem. So should that data be shared? Absolutely. Is it? It's not. Why not? Because of privacy rules. And it's not because the privacy rules say you can't do that. They don't really say that. It's because it's enough of a gray area that it makes it difficult to do. And some companies, in fact, some banks in Britain have found little workarounds. That's good. It was costly and more cumbersome, but others haven't. And that's wrong because ordinary, honest people shouldn't be subsidizing fraudsters because of a law that was misplaced because it was created 35 years ago.
Okay, and that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, I think, is that adjusting so rapidly to the changing access to data, using the data, understanding the data, and then it comes to telling the story with the data, right? Reaching in and finding the relevance and then communicating that relevance to a world that is not prepared to be data scientists and go through the spreadsheets and pull it out. Instead, we have to find that way of using common language to communicate the value that this data is bringing in a way that causes people either to not react negatively or to immediately understand the value so that they can act on it.
Yeah, I mean, well, it takes leadership. I mean, it takes leadership from the point of view of the person who's close to the data to recognize that they need to militate on behalf of using it. So they need to be maybe what I'll call the human API, the interface between the data on one side and the decision maker and the senior managers or the politicians on the other. But it takes leadership from the point of view of the senior managers and boards of directors and politicians as well, because they're going to have to fight the good fight and to say to the public, hey, we're going to use this information. You might be a little bit scared at the outset. Hear me out, have an open mind. Here's why we're doing this. So much of privacy law is really about trying to prevent annoying ads online when it comes to digital privacy. And it's really a pity because if we could take healthcare records, electronic healthcare records, and learn about what best predicts a disease long before someone has the overt symptoms, but when they're just in the most subtlest of forms, we can save people's lives. And if you go to someone who has been in a medical situation, a crisis situation, you said, hey, would you have been willing to have been treated at less impact with a better outcome? 2 years ago for this. Today, of course, they're going to say yes. So I think we need to be very humanist about how we approach data. And that's a debate that's not happening in society, but it must.
Well, doesn't that get to the heart of whether as data practitioners or data authorities, we are capable of changing as fast as the data outcomes are changing? Is there a gap between the findings and the richness that's coming out and those of us that manage the data?
So there is that gap, but I would point that for most of the people who are working with the data, they sort of know this. They're kind of perplexed and bewildered why they can't actually use the data for the effects that they'd like to. They are sort of stunned into paralysis because they try to militate with their bosses and their managers and their boards of directors and CEOs when they get that high, as well as politicians, and they're not making headway. And you can imagine if you're a British politician, the idea of reassessing privacy law ever so slightly to allow for voice prints among criminals, you could take that on, but you're fighting Brexit, right? You're fighting Islamic
terrorism. There are other
terrorism.
things on the plate.
Other priorities, and so this has to be brought forward as a central priority. If it's not, we're not a wise society, and I think we can do better.
Okay, well, we have a lot of opportunities to do better with everything that's happening with the concept of a data visionary or data authority. I think you touched on the point that we think of leadership in this role sometimes as the CEO or as the person in charge, but oftentimes the data authority really is the person who's closer to the data, who actually can act and see the intrinsic value there and then communicate that up the chain.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's always been the case that typically leaders at the highest level, when you're low and you regard your CEO of a large company, it looks like this person has all the power. But interestingly, they really don't, and they certainly don't. They sort of confide in their subordinates to say, I need these things done and I can't do it alone. I need a team around me that can get it done. I need the people at the lowest level of the organization to make the decisions that need to be made. Those people at the lower levels need to take the initiative, and that's actually leadership, that initiative to step forward, identify possibilities of doing great things, and make the case. And here they need to be skilled at it. They need to be diplomats, they need to be statisticians, they need to think in a management mindset, not just a technical mindset, to make the case and say, hey, we're going to do this, we should do this, you're not going to like it when I tell it to you, hear me out, right? Just have an open mind, because I'm going to make the case of why we can do it, what your objections are going to be, how we're going to win other people onto our side, and how I'll brief your boss too when you brief them to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. And I've seen lots of great winning organizations empower people at the lowest levels to do that. And I've also seen organizations that typically don't do that. And you really see it in their corporate performance, because great ideas need a meritocracy with which to swarm up. And if they lose that opportunity, particularly with data, because it's all the engineers, all the geeks that understand the stuff and can actually get the findings from it, then corporate performance suffers, business performance, consumers suffer, employees suffer, and really talented employees go elsewhere because they're not expressing and fulfilling themselves at work because they've got other options because they're good employees.
Well, what's starting to emerge is maybe some advice for those that could be the next generation of data authorities. So one of the first things I'm hearing is the human API, which I love that concept. The second is accountability to be that human API.
Exactly.
And then language, right? Sometimes our own jargon holds us back. And developing a way of translating the value, back to the point that you were making, the value of data, reusing data, and find different ways to convey that. Would there be any other advice for people out there that are starting to think of themselves as more a data authority or a data practitioner?
So I think that covers the skill set you need. Now then you need to be able to execute it well and bounce back from comebacks. But I'd point to you and ask you the question, because you're a marketer. Your job, in effect, is to be somewhat of a human API between the techies that say one thing and the general public that has a different expectation of how they're going to interact with information. How do you manage that?
I think the first step is thinking about the audience. With whom am I trying to speak? Marketing speak for that would be a persona. And then developing different languages for each of those persona. Then also understanding that each of those possible prospects, customers, partners, employees is probably in a different stage of the journey of understanding what data can be doing for them, which means then behind that understanding that there is process, there have to be process implications, and I would say tools, but that's not the lead part of it. I think it is giving them examples that will help them spark. So you were talking about innovation. There's two styles of coming at innovation. One is mandate, thou shalt go innovate. Another one is 10,000 campfires of innovation. But what creates that is often just giving one example.
Yep.
Right? And then somebody being able to spark off of that. What I think you were very powerful at is pulling from a suite of examples. And that's what any good marketer does, is just knowing which story to pull when to get that spark to go.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about data is because some of these issues are new, we have to take the language from other things and turn it into analogies to express it. So when I've talked about leadership before, I've talked about the need for a control tower that their company should have and take a great executive from among the ranks and have the person report to the CEO, and the CEO have a division that is in charge of all the data with a gun and badge to do things and clunk heads and get the data and find the great insights from it. Empowerment of it. So it's interesting, I'm using the word control tower, gun and badge. It's this idea that this permissibility is important, but we have to take all of these images from other things to apply it to data, because these practices are so new. We're not doing it now. We simply couldn't do it 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And because we're doing it today, it's showing that there's some organizations that are doing extremely well reusing their data, extracting new forms of value from it. But I'm really mystified why so many parts of society are not doing that.
That is something we're certainly looking forward to in the future. I want to thank you very much for joining us. Kenneth, thank you very much.
Thank
Jenny,
you.
thank you.
Great to be here.
We've been joined by Kenneth Cukier, Senior Editor for the Digital for The Economist, and Jenny Grimes, Vice President of Marketing. Thanks again.
Thanks.